One of the ways to study our biosphere is to look at the biogeochemical cycles that are at work in on the Earth. And these biochemical cycles are just the way that substances move throughout our biosphere as as life continues and provides all the essential things that life needs. Now, one of the common cycles that we've already studied so far is the water cycle that we had earlier in this chapter, how water is moved around through evaporation and condensation and precipitation and runoff and percolation and all those words like that we had. But water is continually cycled throughout the Earth's atmosphere, this whole process driven by the sun. Another uh, cycle that's very important for living things is the nitrogen cycle. And then we also have the oxygen and carbon cycles that we will be studying uh, in this section. The nitrogen cycle or first of all, we need to talk about maybe where nitrogen is actually found. Uh, Nitrogen cycle just kind of illustrates the interdependence within the biotic community as well as between the abiotic and the biotic factors. And DNA and RNA contain nitrogenous bases. That means they contain nitrogen. Um, Nitrogen is also found in the amino acids that are found in that make up protein. And here is some nitrogenous bases, and you can see the N's in the formula between those dashes. Those is nitrogen, so it's an important part of the DNA and RNA. Nitrogen itself is pretty common in the atmosphere. It's 78%, but most of the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere is useless to most living things. So how does nitrogen then become available for living things to use? And that happens through a process called nitrogen fixation. And nitrogen fixation occurs when we have bacteria and plants working together, a mutualistic relationship between those. And the bacteria provides the usable nitrogen compounds to a plant, and then this plant in turn provides a home for and food for the bacteria to live. So here is the overall nitrogen cycle. You can see that there is a short cycle and a long cycle. The nitrogen that in the short cycle involves decomposer bacteria and fungi breaking down dead organic substances and converting that nitrogen into those compounds called ammonia. That's the NH3 or NH3. You can see kind of in the middle of the diagram. And then that in turn is absorbed by plants, and then these ammonium, and it's converted into ammonium ions, which are later converted, as you can see down toward the bottom. Denitrifying bacteria will convert those into nitrites, and then some other bacteria will convert them into nitrates, and the nitrates are the form that plants can actually use. Then over on the long cycle, you can see that the gaseous nitrogen is being converted into a usable compound, and for centuries farmers have known that there are many crops that can grow better in soil that has some legumes planted in it for several years. They serve for like fertilizer. So clover, beans, alfalfa, and peas are plants that add nitrogen to the soil. And but early in the last century, scientists discovered that bacteria would grow in these nodules in the roots of plants, and they could carry on nitrogen fixation and convert nitrogen into a form that plants can use. Now, to a much smaller extent, lightning can convert nitrogen into compounds that can enter the nitrogen cycle, but it's just to a small extent. And nitrogen compounds can escape the nitrogen short cycle can be offset by the nitrogen fixation of the long cycle. The oxygen cycle is another important one, and we clearly benefit from that. There is free oxygen in the atmosphere, and that atmospheric oxygen can also be dissolved in water so that animals that live in the water, uh, have gills and things like that, can absorb this oxygen from the water. But oxygen that most of the world needs is produced through photosynthesis by plants, and then we, or every living thing, uses this oxygen during the process of respiration, where oxygen is combined ultimately with uh, food, and we derive the energy from that, and in the process of respiration we produce carbon dioxide. So whether you're an autotroph or a heterotroph, uh, you will need oxygen. And then in the process, carbon dioxide is released, which will be another cycle. So here is the oxygen cycle, and you can see there's oxygen in the atmosphere that living things, plants and animals, both need to carry on respiration. And then the respiration, uh, when we exhale, or plants give off plants and animals both give off carbon dioxide, and then plants will use this carbon dioxide to make food, and also a byproduct of that is oxygen. The Now animal waste will be decomposed in the soil, and that will also give off carbon dioxide. Plants, when they decompose, also give off carbon dioxide. But carbon is stored in plant tissues, which then animals eat, uh, and the carbon then is then stored in the animal's tissue. So it's oxygen and carbon dioxide are very closely connected to each other. The carbon dioxide is part of the carbon cycle, and it also is found in our atmosphere. It dissolves in water very readily, and remember that it is produced through respiration, but also through burning. Anytime you burn um, any plant material or fossil fuels or something like that, it's giving off carbon dioxide. And then when things decay, carbon dioxide is also given off. And autotrophs, plants and algae, will take this carbon dioxide, and along with water and uh, energy from the sunlight, to produce sugar that they will need, as well as other living things will need. So here is the summary of the carbon cycle. You can see in the very center we have animals respiring, that could include us. Plants carry on respiration. Um, when animals decay, it produces carbon dioxide. Uh, Plants will then take that carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and convert it into an organic carbon compound, sugar, that we can derive energy from. Now, in addition to that carbon cycle, we know that factories and vehicles also produce a considerable amount of carbon dioxide. Some of it, of the carbon dioxide, is absorbed into the ocean. So the ocean can hold a lot of carbon dioxide. Now, what are the uh, limiting factors that will affect uh, growth? So whether or not an organism can exist in a particular habitat depends on certain limiting factors, and these factors that in some way limit the growth or existence of that organism. And some of the limiting factors would be temperature, too hot or too cold, uh, water, not enough water, too much water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, sunlight, uh, predators. All of those things will limit the growth or the existence of an organism. And the limiting, just because it's a limiting factor doesn't mean that you have too little of it. It could be too little, but it also could be too much, could also be a limiting factor. And when one factor affects the growth or existence of an organism, that can have a domino effect on other organisms. Like if there's too few rabbits, then the predators don't have enough food. We have studied this before. The one limiting factor is the range of tolerance, and this was our example that we had, a diagram that we've seen earlier, that living things, as far as temperature, for instance, is concerned, was what we're looking at right here. There's a range of temperatures that where the animal will function very well, and that's in the optimal range. Uh, there is a range of temperatures that animals can tolerate, but when it falls outside of the optimal range, they don't do as well. Like, for instance, some plants will stop growing, won't flower, or things like that. Same thing if it gets too hot. So that is a range of tolerance, but the organism will do best when it's inside its optimal range. So we have the optimal range, and then we have the range of tolerance. The wide range of tolerance for all factors will cause an organism to have a very wide distribution. We have some animals that we've talked about earlier in this chapter that we can find almost all over the U.S. or maybe even all over the world, because they have a very wide range of tolerance for all factors, and so they're very good at surviving. Now, we also have learned that when animals reproduce is a very critical time, and the conditions have to be just right for that to occur. So God has placed within animals the ability to know when is the proper time to reproduce and have their young, particularly like in birds in the northern part of the world, where can be very cold in winter, and the summers are short. Uh, they have to time their reproduction so that the young have enough time to grow and be able to then migrate south. Now, what are some types of limiting factors? Well, we have one of them that's called density dependent factor. and those are the ones that become more limiting as the population density increases. So as the number of organisms living in an area increases, the density may limit their growth, uh, not in size so much as in numbers. Uh, then we have density independent. This is where growth is limited no matter what the size of the population. So we'll have some factors that will limit uh, any population no matter what its size. Density population is just one where as the size increases, the growth in the number of organisms starts falling off. Now, populations can change over time. So in nature, populations rarely are static, which means they don't stay the same. They're either growing in numbers or they're decreasing in numbers. And birth rate and versus death rate are the most significant factors that affect this. Um, if the birth rate exceeds the death rate, then the population will increase. If the death rate is exceeding the birth rate, then the population will decrease. The population in an area can change if we have individuals that are moving into an area. Then we'll have, that's called immigration, and they'll move into an area. But the population could also decrease if we have organisms emigrating, which means moving out of an area. And so all of these affect the population. Now, when the rates are in balance, that means birth rate and death rate are equal to each other. And if there's immigration and immigration, maybe let's say happening at the same rate, then the population size is going to stay relatively constant. Now, what are some limiting factors, or how do these limiting factors influence population growth? Well, if there are no limiting factors, or then we would expect exponential growth. That means, as you look at the diagram down here toward the right, notice that as you proceed to the right in the graph, it's going up more steeply. So the population would increase very rapidly. The population of the Earth uh, was only experienced slow growth for many thousands of years, but more recently has experienced very rapid growth. And some people are concerned that there wouldn't be enough room. Uh, Now,